All right, welcome back everyone. Today we'll be looking at long-term memory as part of the multi-store model, and we'll be working out the capacity, duration, and coding of long-term memory, and alongside also the coding of short-term memory, as both of these codings have been identified in one single experiment by Baddeley. In this lesson, we'll be looking at the duration and capacity of long-term memory with the yearbooks study by Barak et al. Then we're going to look at coding, and we're going to do this in conjunction with the coding of short-term memory. And that unifying study that looks at the coding of long and short-term memory is the wordless study by Baddeley. We're going to look at consolidation and retrieval, which are the mechanisms by which information flows in between long and short-term memory. And then we're going to look at some criticism of the multi-store model as a whole. So let's look at the duration of memory. How long does a memory stick in your brain? Is there a limit to it? Let's find out. In this experiment, Barak et al. Took 392 Americans between the ages of 17 and 74. So long, big range of age, and we'll see in a minute why that is. What these participants had to do, depending on the group they were assigned to, was either to recognize photos from their yearbook. And if you don't know what a yearbook is, in the United States, especially there, when you graduate, you get a book that students produce that has pictures of everyone who graduated or even who went to school in that year with their names underneath. It's kind of like a reference to remember who went to the same school as you did. And you can keep that in your house, and 50 years down the line, you can still have like a recollection of who you graduated with. Now, assuming that all of these 17 to 74-year-olds went to high school and had one of these yearbooks, right? You can then check how much of that yearbook information do they still recall. The 17-year-old recently graduated and therefore should know everything or near to everything, and the 74-year-old may already have forgotten some information from that yearbook, right? Because it was so long ago that they graduated. So in group one, they were given 50 pictures of people and asked which of them were from their yearbook, right? So not all of them were from the yearbook, but some of those 50 pictures. In the second group, the free recall group, they had to recall as many names from their yearbook as they could. So imagine having to, like 50 years down the line, having to recall the names of the people you graduated with. And so those are the two conditions. Now, it's important to note that the first one is a recognition task. So you get information and you have to tell whether this is correct or false information. So if this was a picture of somebody from the yearbook or not. And the second group is a recall group. There was no information shown. They had to take it out of their long-term memory actively, right? It wasn't like recognizing a name. They had to actually remember and then write down the name. And the results show this. There was a 90% correct photo identification after 15 years after graduation, and a 70% correct identification after 48 years. So 48 years not going to school and still being able to correctly identify 70% of the images and saying in 70% of the cases, yeah, that was from the yearbook. In group two, where they had to recall the names, they managed to recall 60% of the names after 15 years and 30% of the names after 48 years, which is worse than in group one, but still quite impressive. So we can draw multiple conclusions. Firstly, long-term memory can last a lifetime, but some of it decays, right? 90% of the images were correctly identified, but not 100. It tells us that we can remember things for a long period of time. Oh, sorry, I should be pointing out actually 48 years, so 70%. So we can remember things for a long time, but there is some decay going on. And second of all, recall gets worse, is worse than recognition. So having to bring something out of your long-term memory actively is harder to do than having to recognize something that is placed in front of you. And that is quite, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about interference and retrieval failure, when we talk about forgetting. So in summary, we can conclude that long-term memory has an unlimited capacity and duration. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. I have never come across an elderly person that cannot form new long-term memories. In fact, we haven't found a single individual that is not able to form new memories because they ran out of space in their long-term memory, okay? So therefore, the long-term memory capacity is unlimited. And second of all, the duration seems also to be unlimited, although there's some decay. But people, 48 years after graduating, were still able to write down names and recognize pictures on photos. And that is also people that are 100 years old can still do that. So therefore, long-term memory is unlimited in its duration and capacity. Let's talk a little bit about consolidation and retrieval, which are the mechanisms by which information flows between long-term and short-term memory. Retrieval is the word we use to describe how information is retrieved from long-term memory and brought into short-term memory. And as you might recall, short-term memory is where thinking happens. If I tell you to think of the name of your first pet or the street you live on, that information is now being retrieved from your long-term memory and brought into short-term memory so you can actively think about it. It wasn't there before, now it's in your consciousness and you become aware of it. So that's retrieval. Consolidation is the process of moving something that is only stored for a few seconds through rehearsal. You consolidate information, meaning you make it harder to forget or more resistant to forgetting, and eventually it then moves into long-term memory. So make sure you use these words to describe the movement of information between these two stores. Let's come to coding, and we're going to look at coding for long and short-term memory together because there's one experiment that solves this mystery for both of them. First, let's remind ourselves what coding is in the first place. It's the type of information that a store can hold. What kind of type of informations are there? Let's remind ourselves of the sensory register. We talked about visual information, acoustic information, haptic information. So what kind of coding does short and long-term memory prefer? That is the question. All right, let me walk you through this step by step. First of all, the study was done by Alan Baddeley, 1966, B, and B stands for, it's the second of his experiments in that year. And the goal was to find the modality or the coding of short-term and long-term memory. And we're going to look at two types of coding, which is acoustic and semantic. Acoustic refers to sound and semantic refers to the meaning of something. So if the store, let's pick one of them, let's say short-term memory. If the short-term memory store codes information acoustically, it means that it uses the sound to better identify or store the information. So what do you think? Is it going to be harder or easier to store something that sounds similar? So think about that. Is it going to be easier or harder to store information that is similar, that sounds similar, or that sounds dissimilar? And that's exactly the question he asked himself. So here's a list A, which has acoustically similar words. So shade, blade, wade, grade, and so on. Would it be easier to remember this or list B, acoustically dissimilar? Shade, knife, phone, spoon, book. They all sound very different. Let's suppose short-term memory stores acoustic information, or it uses the sound to help it remember. Now, if it uses sound to help it remember, then it should be easier to memorize the dissimilar list, acoustically dissimilar list, right? Because if everything sounds the same, it's going to be really hard to keep those words apart and remember them. But if they sound different, it should be easier. That's the hypothesis. We can do the same hypothesis with semantic coding. What does semantic mean again? Semantic refers to the meaning of things. So we can have a semantically similar word, words that mean similar things like small, slim, short, brief, terse. They all refer to something small. We can also have a semantically dissimilar list like small, book, glass, cup, wall, very, very different items. All right. Now, if your store, whether it is short or long-term memory, uses the meaning, so the semantics of the information to differentiate between the words, then it should be harder to remember similar meaning words, but easier to remember different meaning words. Okay? So that's the hypothesis. Let's see what happens. And first we gotta, one more thing before we continue. They're gonna be remembering a list of 10 words, and each shown for 3 seconds. There's gonna be an interference task so that there is no rehearsal. And they're gonna be asked to recall the word list either immediately after exposure or 20 minutes later. If you ask them immediately after, you are testing short-term memory. If you ask them 20 minutes later, you're testing long-term memory, because by that time, the information should have already moved into long-term memory. Let's look at the results for the immediate recall, right? So now we're testing short-term memory. And it turns out that list A, the acoustically similar words, had the worst recall out of all the word lists. This list right here, which is the acoustically similar word list, had the worst recall, which means short-term memory stores acoustic information. This is because when the words sound similar, it has difficulties remembering them, right? Let's personify short-term memory. Let's suppose from the point of view from short-term memory gets information in and says, all right, how can I remember all of these different words? Oh gosh, they all sound so similar, but I love listening to words and hearing the differences, but now there are hardly any differences. It's going to be so hard to remember. Therefore, we know, because the performance in this first list was the worst compared to all 3 others, tells us that short-term memory wants acoustically different kind of sounding words in order to memorize something better. So that tells us short-term memory codes information acoustically. So its coding is acoustic. Here are the results with a 20-minute delay. This is looking at long-term memory. And in the long-term memory, the list C, the semantically similar words, had the worst recall. It's this list right here. These words were remembered the worst. And why is that? It's because long-term memory cares about the meaning of things. And when things sound similar, it is harder to recall. It's harder to keep those words apart and remember them individually. But if everything means something different, then it's easier to remember because long-term memory uses the meaning, the semantic of something to remember it. So in conclusion, we can say long-term memory stores semantic information. This is because when the words have similar meaning, it has difficulties remembering them. All right, so let's complete our picture here and say short-term memory codes acoustic information and long-term memory codes semantic information. Fantastic. This is the summary slide for the multi-store model, listing the capacity, duration, and coding for each, and underneath you've got the studies that proved that particular fact. Let's look at some criticism of the multi-store model. Shallis and Warrington say the multi-store model is too simplistic. Why do they believe that? They studied a patient by the name of KF. KF had a motorcycle accident, which resulted in brain damage, and subsequently he suffered from amnesia, so he was forgetting things. Okay, and they were giving him a task. The task was to remember numbers that were either read out to him, so acoustic information, or he had to read the numbers to himself, so that's visual information, right? And the result is that KF was much better at recalling numbers when he read the numbers, so option B, he read the numbers, compared to when they were read out to him. Why is that? Well, it suggests that there must be separate memory systems that process visual and verbal information, right? So short-term memory, which is both of these tasks, reading something out and then having something read out and then writing down the answer, or reading it yourself and then writing it down. The fact that you can perform these two things at different levels of ability suggests that there are different parts of the brain involved in these two processes. And this alludes to the next chapter, which suggests that actually the multi-store model is too simplistic. We need to get more detail in there and see why this is. Why is KF able to remember something better when he reads it out compared to when something is read out to him? If you're interested in learning how to train your brain to remember more, there are certain tricks you can use, like something called memory palaces. And this documentary, it's a very short one, follows these memory masters that go to competitions and memorize as much as they can. And it shows you what kind of tricks they use to achieve that. And I'll leave the link to this video in the video description below. Leave a like if you liked it, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when we drop a new video. Download these and many more slides for free, and consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to detailed mind maps and past exam revision content. If you're a teacher, get free access to ZenTeach, an online quizzing tool with ready-to-go multiple choice quizzes and automated feedback. Make sure to use this invite code, which is, like all links, in the video description below.